Welcome to Faith Space Ottawa, a space for all of us to grow closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together at our own pace. Come as you are to faith as it is.
الصلاة والسلام على الرسول المصطفى.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this gathering to be in our scale of good deeds. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward you for the time that you spare for His sake. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this to be of benefit. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to exit from this gathering with hearts more steadfast in the path, more loving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more following of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Say Ameen. Ameen Rabbil Alameen. And welcome to Faith. I know that today happens to be a bit of a special day with all that's going on in Gaza and Palestine and now Lebanon. And so it is, subhanAllah, a date to remember and a date to commemorate. And we just found out just a few hours earlier that there was actually a protest going on today and happening. And so we were thinking, maybe we should just postpone today's event or cancel it. And then did a quick poll, and many people are coming or many people aren't going to the protest. So we said, okay, no, we'll hold the session even if it's a little short, and we'll make it happen. And hopefully we will record it, and then people can catch up, inshallah. All right, that said, we are diving into the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And we're doing so by pondering the seerah and the meanings that we can deduce from it and lessons that we can apply in our day-to-day lives. Now, this can never be in seclusion of what's going on in the world, so we want to try to be relevant with the lessons that we learn, inshallah, because the seerah is not simply a story for us to be nostalgic about or to reminisce or to enjoy. It is actually a model for us to look up to. And as Sheikh Ahmed Khalil says, it is really a methodology for revival. And our ummah, the ummah of Islam, is much in need of a revival today more than perhaps any time in its history. And as such, we need to reflect and study the methodology of revival that was adopted by the Prophet ﷺ. And so we are pondering the seerah of the Prophet to learn and to reflect and to take lessons that we can take with us, bi'idhnillah rabbil alameen. And as usual, we have the brief intros and why this series, and then we'll touch upon today's session. We'll talk about the youth of the Prophet ﷺ, called it the youth of gold, and then we will conclude with a few questions, inshallah. And so, why this series? Very powerful verse in the Quran, Surah Al-Qalam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that you, O Prophet, are truly a man of outstanding character. And the word la'ala could also be translated to be upon great character, right? So the Prophet ﷺ is upon great character, he was upon great character. His great character is one that we need to study and reflect and learn from, inshallah. And so this is a very, kind of to the point verse that touches on the character of the Prophet and how outstanding it is, how great it is, subhanAllah. We also have a very interesting verse that says in Surah An-Nur, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن تُطِيعُوهُ تَهْتَدُوا, that if you obey the Prophet ﷺ, you will be rightly guided. وَمَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ الْمُبِينُ, and the messenger's duty is only to deliver the message clearly. And so there's a very interesting kind of correlation between the word تَهْتَدُوا, meaning be rightly guided, to a dua that we all make in Surah Al-Fatiha, perhaps 17 times a day if we uphold our fara'id, where we say, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم, guide us to the straight path. Right? And so here is perhaps a response to that dua, that if you want to truly be amongst those that are guided by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all we need to do is really follow in the footsteps of the Prophet ﷺ, listen to the Prophet ﷺ, abide by the Prophet ﷺ, and we will find the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala therein. And the next part, the next kind of sentence here, it says the messenger's duty is only to deliver the message clearly. It shows that really the message of the Prophet or the message of Islam, all the messenger needs to do, and anybody that follows in the footsteps of the messenger, is to deliver it with clarity, right? Elsewhere, the balagh or the delivery is described as a balaghul mubin, right? The very clear, very evident, here it is, al balaghul mubin, the very clear and evident delivery, right? So it's not just about delivering the message, it's also about delivering it with clarity. And kind of quote this part of the verse that says al balaghul mubin, to highlight that when we come to advise somebody, when we come to try to teach somebody, try to deliver, a message to somebody, it's not just about you venting or you expressing what you think is right and wrong. It's also about that it actually is delivered in a clear fashion. Not clear to you only, but clear to the person on the receiving end, right? Because the point of delivering the message is that it reaches the other person. All right, Now let's touch on a few events that happened during the youth of the Prophet ﷺ and learn some lessons from it, bi'idhnillah. Here is a very interesting segment from Ibn Ishaq's Seerah. We remember one of the main sources of Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ is actually a book written by Ibn Ishaq. And he says when Abdul Muttalib was about to die, he recommended to Abu Talib, awsa, that he protect the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, and take care of him. And he recommended him to Abu Talib because Abdullah, the father of the Prophet, and Abu Talib were from the same mother. And so this was something that the grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, did. When he was on his deathbed, he asked, his son Abu Talib to take care of his grandson Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And this kind of shows something very important that we sometimes neglect in our, very smaller circles, and that is sometimes, extended family has no role to play in, the raising of our children, especially in the nuclear families that we have today. And now even the nuclear family is kind of shortened and reduced and becoming even smaller. But we need to recognize that, subhanAllah, extended family has a role to play, whether it be uncles, whether it be aunts, whether it be grandparents, whether it be, cousins. All of those, subhanAllah, it really takes a village to raise a child, subhanAllah. And here is perhaps a response to the question that is posed. And there is a very, 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 perhaps not even a weak hadith, but considered mawdu', meaning misplaced. It has no chain of narration, not this one, but a hadith that says that the Prophet says, alayhi salatu, my grandfather will be resurrected on the Day of Judgment, and he will be atop all the kings, and he will appear in the best shape and best form. And there are other variations of this hadith. Like I said, it is a very misplaced hadith. There is no chain of narration to it, and is often quoted by our Shia brothers and sisters, kind of citing it to say that Abdul Muttalib actually is going to Jannah and is a believer. And so here is a hadith that is actually in Sahih Bukhari that kind of shows otherwise. Because here, on Abu Talib's deathbed, which we will reflect upon later on, inshallah, here the Prophet says to him, Ya am, O uncle, قُل لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ كَلِمَةً أَشْهَدُ لَكَ بِهَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. Say, just say, La ilaha illallah, that none has the right to worship or to be worshipped but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it will be a sentence with which I shall be a witness for you before Allah. In other narrations of this hadith, the Prophet says, أُحَاجُ بِهَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ, meaning I will argue before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on your behalf, right? Just say that sentence. And he was on his deathbed, Abu Talib, but Abu Jahl and Abdullah ibn Abi Umayyah said to Abu Talib, Oh Abu Talib, are you going to denounce the religion of Abdul Muttalib, meaning your father? Ya Abu Talib, أَتَرْغَبُ عَنْ مِلَّةِ Abdul Muttalib? And so Abu Talib was quiet, he did not speak, he did not say the shahada, right? And so it shows that, people around at the time, Abu Jahl, Abu Umayyah, or Abdullah ibn Abi Umayyah, and Abu Talib kind of recognized that Abdul Muttalib was not the follower of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did not believe that in La ilaha illallah. So this is just kind of to respond to that weak narration that, is the grandfather of the Prophet going to Jannah? In the end, we do not know, because that is not our place to say. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that says. And we have another hadith that talks about Ahlul Fatra, the people that are in the time of deficiency, meaning deficiency of the message, because it was before the revelation of the Prophet ﷺ and after Isa alayhi salam. So during those 500 or so years, it is considered Ahlul Fatra, or the people there are considered the people of the time of the deficiency. And there's a special hadith that talks about them. We mentioned this hadith before, that says that they will be tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a separate test, a different type of test on the Day of Judgment. Perhaps, we don't know. But point is, Abu Talib is not from Ahlul Fatra because he witnessed the messenger of the Prophet ﷺ, but Abdul Muttalib is from Ahlul Fatra because he passed away before the Prophet's revelation, before the Prophet's prophethood, that is. All right, just a note on that.
Just out of curiosity,
Sure.
do we know the religion, or is it...
No, millah does not necessarily mean religion per se. It means the path, the way of life, the way of thinking, like that idea, right, of Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib was the leader of the people of Quraysh. He was known to be amongst the people, an idol worshipper among the people. Even though there's some conflicting narrations about that.
Yeah, I heard
right?
something about the lineage of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being monotheists.
Yeah, so we don't know that. There aren't any strong narrations or authentic narrations or even weak narrations actually that kind of, it's usually disconnected narrations entirely that have no chain of narration. Yes?
Sheikh, at this time, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he was a prophet?
In this, yes.
Okay.
and we'll touch upon this later on in more detail, inshallah. But the answer is yes. All right. So back to the childhood of the Prophet ﷺ. And here's a very interesting description given in the book, The Light of Certainty, Nurul Yaqeen, in the biography of the Master of Messengers, في هدي سيد المرسلين, أو في سيرة سيد المرسلين, a book written by Muhammad al-Khudri, a very interesting book. And here he says, when it was time to eat, the children would come and snatch the food away, and he would be content with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make easy for him. This was in the house of Abu Talib. So in the house of Abu Talib, when food would be prepared and be presented, the children would come and kind of snatch the food as quickly as possible, but he was not like that. He was different, alayhi salatu wasalam, even in his childhood. And he had with him Ayman, known as, or her real name is Barakah bint Thalaba. She was with him as well, and he describes her, although it is a weak hadith, but it is, it has a chain of narration, but a little bit weak. He says about her, Hiya ummi, or ummi ba'da ummi. Ayman is my mother after my mother. So she took care of him, right, ever since he was really small, and participated in raising him. And she has a very interesting narration that is quoted in some books of history, although, take these with a little grain of salt, because subhanAllah, we don't have too much of what was going on in the Prophet's life, except the major events during the first 40 years. After that, it becomes very detailed. But here, she says, I never saw him, may God bless him and grant him peace, complain of hunger or thirst, neither in his youth nor in his old age. He would go out in the morning and drink a sip from Zamzam, and sometimes we would offer him food and he would say, I am full. By the way, anybody actually drink Zamzam like a long time ago? Like maybe just 20 years ago? It was very different. It's very different than how it is today, right?
Last time I had it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, so Zamzam 20 years ago, just 20 years ago, is very different than how it is today. Today, it's very diluted. Just 20 years ago, you couldn't, even if they would bring you Zamzam, they would tell you, drink it slowly. Right? Don't gulp it all the way. And it would say this not because there's barakah in it. They would say this because it's actually heavy. It's like heavy with minerals. You gotta drink it slowly. Don't drink it like all of a sudden. It might cause stomach ache, right? Because we're not used to that type of water. And so, but Zamzam today is very diluted, subhanAllah. So back in the day, so to speak, not to age myself, but it used to be that you drink Zamzam and you actually can kind of go about your day for quite some time. Like it was just heavy in minerals. That's how it was, right? Today, not so much. So this is a very interesting narration by Ayman about the childhood of the Prophet ﷺ. Ibn Abbas also reports this. Ibn Abbas is, by the way, Abdullah ibn Abbas. He is the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, but he's a much younger cousin, right? So he did not witness this. So he was most probably told this. So, the kind of, where did he get this information from? We don't know, like he doesn't say. But he says that Abu Talib used to bring the boys their morning meal, and they would put their hands in it and steal it. But the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, would hold back his hand. When Abu Talib saw that, he set aside his food for him. So the food of Muhammad ﷺ would be set aside for him. And again, this shows us of the characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ. And you can imagine, like in his place, he was 8 years old when he moved in to the house of his uncle. And in a way, a little bit of a stranger in that household. Abu Talib is known to have many children, and bringing the food would be a feast, so to speak, where everybody kind of grab your share. If you've ever been in a family that has a bunch of brothers, you know how it's like. And so the idea is that my son, my older one, so he finishes his food, finishes his plate, and then he looks at his siblings, and he's like, are you going to eat that? Are you going to eat that? Are you going to eat that? And then if they're not going to eat it, he grabs it and he finishes it. So anyway, point is the Prophet ﷺ would actually hold back to the extent that Abu Talib would have to set aside his food for him. And I think that, we kind of learn a little bit from this. The Prophet ﷺ, by the way, shared a lot of etiquettes when it comes to eating food, right? So an interesting hadith that he shares, alayhi salatu wasalam, he says, حَسْبُ ibn Adam لُقِيمَاتٍ يُقِمْنَ صُلْبَهِ. It is sufficient for the child of Adam, a few bites of food to strengthen them to stand up straight, right? And so this is an attitude towards food, right? We're not supposed to be foodies. We're supposed to simply consider food to be a source of nourishment that we nourish ourselves with and have the energy to go about that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We all must have heard the hadith that talks about how 1/3 for food, 1/3 for water, 1/3 for breathing, right? And there's a hadith of Prophet where he says, "Al-mu'minu la ya'kulu illa idha ja'a, wa idha akala la yashba'." That a believer only eats when they're hungry, and when they eat, they do not eat to their fullest. right? So these are all etiquettes about food and how to go about food and our perspective of food, right? Of course, there's also the hadith where he says, "Kul biyaminik," eat with your right hand, وَكُلْ مِمَّا يَلِيكَ, and eat from that which is in front of you. In other words, don't extend your hands to that which is in front of other people, right? So all of these are like etiquettes in terms of eating, in terms of understanding that food has a purpose that is to be served, and we should honor the food and honor the people that are also there as well. Here is a very interesting incident that is reported in Sirat Ibn Ishaq, and he says that there was this kind of like they call him a kahin, right? So a priest of idol worship, right, that came visiting Mecca. And he was visiting Mecca, and apparently of the customs of the time was that this priest that came from Yemen would actually observe the children of Mecca. Like the parents, the families of the children would bring their children to this quote-unquote priest. The priest would observe them, look at them. And back then, the priest of idol worship was involved in weird stuff, but also a little bit involved in herbal medicine. There was part, they were kind of connected to each other, right? It was considered magic to be able to heal somebody. So he had that was his role. And Abu Talib came with the Prophet ﷺ to be observed by this priest. But then the priest turned away from him, right? And then, remember, this is not a Christian priest, this is an idol worshiper priest, right? So this priest turned away from him. And then he called out for him. He was like, "Where is that child that I just saw? Waylukum," right? Woe to you. Ruddu alayya al-ghulam alladhi ra'aytu anifa. Return to me the boy that I just saw right now. Where is he? And then he says, فَوَاللَّهِ لَا يَكُونَنَّ لَهُ شَأْنٌ. For by God, he will surely have a great future. The narration says that Abu Talib, when he saw the keenness of this priest to see Muhammad again, he actually protected Muhammad from it and decided to turn away. So the priest started to call out, "Where is he? Let me see him again. I want to see him." And we learn from this a few things again. We're covering these narrations again, to kind of try to learn lessons from it. One is that, when you are in charge of a child, you kind of watch over who is it that's kind of showing interest, for what purpose, right? And that's the guarding that Abu Talib did for the Prophet ﷺ, right? He was guarding the Prophet, he was guarding his nephew as a child. And we see this in a few other stories that will come up, inshallah, how Abu Talib was guarding the Prophet even as he was a child. But we also see that perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in Muhammad ﷺ something to be observed or seen or noticed, right? فَوَاللَّهِ لَا يَكُونَنَّ لَهُ شَأْنٌ. For by God, he will surely have a great future. This was something that was often said, by the way, by people when they would see the Prophet ﷺ, that they would notice this. And I don't know if you've ever felt that before when you've come across a child and you felt this child is like, he's really smart, or she's really clever, she's very analytical, her questions are very on point, or you feel that this is someone that's going to grow to be something, inshallah, right? You have that sense, subhanAllah, sometimes when you come across people. And this is actually something that the Prophet ﷺ is described of, to notice these characteristics in people, the potential in people, right? They call it in Arabic, tafa'ul Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? In English, it translates to the optimism of the Prophet ﷺ, or the, being optimistic about the future of people. But in English, it sounds like it's a good luck charm kind of attitude, but that's not how it is in Arabic. In Arabic, actually, it is about noticing characteristics, right? So he noticed the characteristics of justice, for example, in Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. Even though Umar was only Muslim for a few minutes, we'll touch upon that story later, but he says to Umar, "Ya Umar, anta al-faruq, yafriqu Allah bika bayna al-haqqi wal-batil." Oh Umar, you are a separator. Allah will use you to separate between truth and falsehood. What? Umar just a few hours ago was intending to kill the Prophet, and now he's just been Muslim for a few minutes, and yet the Prophet sees this characteristic. He sees how he has this strength when it comes to the truth to uphold it. The Prophet also saw this in Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He says, "You are ghulamun mu'allim. You are a lad that will become a teacher." And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, lo and behold, becomes a teacher. He sees it in Abdullah ibn Abbas, whom we quoted earlier. Abdullah ibn Abbas, by the way, was around 13, 14 when the Prophet passed away. Again, he saw in Abdullah ibn Abbas certain characteristics, and he made dua for him. Allahumma faqihhu fi din. Oh Allah, give Abdullah ibn Abbas fiqh and knowledge when it comes to our deen, understanding of our deen. And Abdullah Abbas becomes a scholar of Islam known as Habrul Ummah, right? The scholar of Islam. And so we see these characteristics, right? And so perhaps we need to kind of have this. In Arabic, by the way, they call it farasa, right? The word farasa is to have this ability to read between the lines, the ability to see things beyond the superficial, right? Farasatul mu'min is actually a characteristic. The believer should have this kind of characteristic, the ability to see beyond what is superficial, right? Wisdom in seeing things. And here is a very interesting narration about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected the Prophet alayhi salam. Here the Prophet, he describes, this is narrated in Ibn Hisham. It is a broken hadith. Now what a broken hadith means is that it does not have a correct chain of narration, right? So a chain of narration of hadith should be like, on this, on that, on that. So this person, heard that person, heard this person, all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. That's a complete chain of narration. This one is broken, right? But I bring it because it's reported in Seerah ibn Hisham, which is, like I said, the most kind of, oldest perhaps reference of Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Here the Prophet says, I saw myself as a lad, لَقَدْ رَأَيْتُنِي فِي غِلْمَانِ قُرَيْشٍ, amongst the lads of Quraysh, carrying stones for some game that the lads played with. So it's some kind of game that required lots of stones to be carried. So he used his thawb, his clothing, to carry it as everybody else was, and they had to lift up their thawb, right? Now today everybody wears underwear, back then they didn't. So he says we were all naked, and he says he took his lower part and put it around his neck, carrying the stones on it. And I was with them like that, and then someone struck me, right? إِذْ لَكَمَنِي لَاكِمْ مَا أَرَاهُ. Somebody struck the Prophet that he did not see. And it was a painful blow. لَكْمَةً وَجِيعًا. It really hurt the Prophet. ثم قال, this stranger said to Muhammad, شِدَّ عَلَيْكَ إِزَارَكَ, meaning, tighten your lower garment, right? So he did that. فَأَخَذْتَهُ وَشَدَدْتَهُ عَلَيْهِ. So I tightened my lower garments, I covered myself, in other words, right? And I began to carry the stones on my neck and my lower garment, and on me among my companions, min bayna ashabi. So this is a moment of childhood of the Prophet ﷺ playing with other children, but it's a moment where perhaps a stranger teaches him something, right? Now, imagine if a stranger were to, strike your child, right? And say this to your child. You'd call what? Protective services, the police, you'd not accept even somebody to point out something wrong to your child. That's the world that we live in today. Like, we're so disconnected, so worried about each other, so scared that this other person is actually a criminal, and there's lots of real, evidence that, that may be the case, and rightfully so, right? But back then, things were simpler, and like I said, it takes a village to raise a child, and so it's very common, by the way, to have strangers speak to you and teach you a lesson, right? So if anybody here has actually, grew up in the Middle East at one point in time, or anywhere in the Muslim country, you may have come across that. And it may have come actually as harsh. You may remember it, right? Sometimes it's very harsh, right? Like this was really harsh, right? So, but it still teaches something that is perhaps important, right? Of course, within moderation. All right, this is a story that you may have heard about before, and we want to cover a little bit, inshallah, an experience the Prophet had when he is around 12, some say 13, some say 14 years old. Alayhi salatu wasalam actually goes out with his uncle Abu Talib on the first caravan that he participates in. Right? So it's the first time the Prophet goes out on a caravan, and his uncle Abu Talib is working as a merchant, and he takes his nephew with him, and they go out and they go all the way to Ash-Sham, to an area called Basra, and there they come across a monk named Bahira. This Christian monk is described as a rahib, right? And by the way, the Prophet talks about rahbaniyah. He says, rahbaniyatan ibtada'uha, monkship or monasticism that is innovated. It's not part of deen, it's not part of revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is an act that some people have taken to distance themselves from this world. And so Bahira was like that. He was living in seclusion, away from society, on his own, in what is called, actually in the hadith, it says sawma'a. And a sawma'a is like a church that is kind of closed off. It's not like welcoming people or addressing people's needs or giving advice to people or anything like that. Like it's just what's the word? It's monastery. Like that's the word, a monastery. But this monk in this monastery never came out to meet the caravans, never came out to see the people from Mecca. But he did this time. And he came to them and he was looking through them until he came to the Prophet ﷺ. And then he said, هذا سيد العالمين هذا رسول رب العالمين يبعثه الله رحمة للعالمين. So this is in Jami' al-Tirmidhi. It is a weak narration, a very disputed narration, by the way. Many scholars say that there's lots of aspects to it that are incorrect, and so take it with a grain of salt again. But it's worth mentioning. And then they ask him, why do you say this? Like, why do you say this about Muhammad alayhi salam? Why are you saying that he is like, Sayyidul Alameen, or like the Lord of the worlds, or like, what's all of that about? How do you know? And then he says the following. He says, إِنَّكُمْ حِينَ أَشْرَفْتُمْ مِنَ الْعَقَبَةِ. When you were coming close to us, right, from along the road, لم يبق شجرة ولا حجر إلا خر ساجدا. No rock nor tree was left except that it prostrated. Right? ولا يسجدون إلا للنبي. And that never happens except for a prophet. وإني أعرفه بخاتم النبوة أسفل من غضروف كتفه. And I can recognize him by the seal of prophethood which is below his shoulder blade like an apple. The prophet had a mark on his back, right? That is called Khatam al-Nubuwah. That mark on his back there's a story to recognizing it. So it is authentically there, not because of this narration, but because of another story, the story of Salman al-Farisi. That's when perhaps it's mentioned again. And so it is there. And Salman al-Farisi radiallahu anh, knows about it. How? Because of a Christian priest that tells him that one of the signs of prophethood is that he will have this kind of mark on his back, right? And right below his shoulder blades. And so here, Bahira, the monk, he recognizes that and he says the following, right? He also says something else. He says, فَرْجَعْ بِابْنِ أَخِيكَ. Take your nephew back to his country and beware of the Jews on his behalf. وَاحْذَرْ عَلَيْهِ يَهُودٍ فَوَاللَّهِ لَإِنْ رَأَوْهُ وَعَرَفُوا مِنْهُ مَا عَرَفْتَ لَا يَبْغَنَّهُ شَرًّا. They will seek to harm him. فإنه كائن لابن أخيك هذا شأن عظيم. فإنه كائن لابن أخيك هذا شأن عظيم. There will be, for this nephew of yours, a great future, a great matter. فأسرع به إلى بلاده. So hurry, take him back to his country. Meaning, take him back to his town, protect him. And he specifically says, beware of Jews, right? Specifically. Now, you might look at this and be like, oh, that's so anti-Semitic. Well, here he is specifically talking about specific Jews that are in the region. That's one. And two, like I said, this hadith is very weak in its authenticity, very disputed. There are other versions of the hadith that actually does not mention Jews per se, right? But he talks about people that may see Muhammad ﷺ and recognize signs of prophethood in the Prophet ﷺ and want to hurt him because of it. Now, this isn't too far-fetched because we do have authentic narrations of when the Prophet went to Medina, ﷺ, where the Jews of Medina do recognize the signs of prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And so we'll talk about that when the time comes, when we touch upon Hijrah, if Allah prolongs our lives till then, but it's worthy of noting. And by the way, a side comment, just a side comment, and again, take that comment with a grain of salt. But you know how sometimes we have in our du'as that we would make du'a against the Jews, right? And sometimes Jews and Christians, al-Yahud wa nasara. And so it is in some of our du'as, like all throughout history, it's been there. And it's very important to realize something about that this is not something the Prophet did, alayhi salatu, but it's something that people did, right? Yes, they may be Muslim, but they're people, right? They're not something to take our yardstick or measuring stick based upon, right? The other thing is that they usually do not mean all Christians and all Jews, right? Usually what they mean is the Christians that actually have attacked us, the Jews that have actually attacked us, right? So that's what they mean. Because throughout history in the Muslim world, in the Muslim lands, that's where Jews and Christians were allowed to live safely and freely. When Amr ibn al-As opened Egypt, that's when the highest patriarch of the Christian church, of the Coptic church, was able to come back to Egypt. When Umar ibn al-Khattab opened Jerusalem, that's when the Jews were allowed, right? Jewish people were allowed to come. I said the Jews. Jewish people were allowed to come to Jerusalem after being expelled by the Roman Empire, right? By the Byzantine Empire of the time. And so, we have a very flourishing, powerful example of living amongst non-Muslims and having non-Muslims live amongst Muslims safely and peacefully as long as they are not picking up arms against us, right? Here, again, it's about attitude, it's about practice, it's not about casting a people aside. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَيْسُوا سَوَاءً. They are not the same. There are those that are very honest and have integrity, and there are those that are unfortunately thieving and racist and supremacist in their attitude. And so it's very important to kind of recognize this. This is a very common chant, by the way, that is often done in Palestinian, pro-Palestinian protests, and that is Khaybar, Khaybar ya Yahud, Jaysh Muhammad sawfa yaud, right? Which means, remember Khaybar, O Jewish people, the army of Muhammad will come back. And so what are they doing here? They're equating all Jewish people with the Jews of Khaybar. The Jews of Khaybar were treacherous. They were enemies of Islam. They attacked the Prophet ﷺ. They kind of gave solace and refuge to enemies of Islam, right? They plotted against the Prophet ﷺ. That's not representative of all Jews. And we see this, subhanAllah, in our protests today, in gatherings. We see many Jewish people that are very much anti-Zionist, much more than many Muslims, unfortunately, right? So it's very important to make that distinction between people and realize that that's not the right chant to make. We should definitely talk against Zionist occupiers. Zionists, by the way, whether they be Muslim, whether they be Jewish, whether they be Christian. Yes, there are Muslim Zionists, unfortunately, right? So it's a very important point. This is a bit of a tangent, but let's come back, inshallah. So what were the early jobs of the Prophet ﷺ? We'll touch upon this next time as well, inshallah, because he had another job. But earlier on, in that same hadith, by the way, there's a description given of what the Prophet was doing on this caravan. Like, what was he? Was he like going there to be a merchant? What was he? So here it says, وَكَانَ هُوَ فِي رَعِيَّةِ الْإِبِلِ. He, the Prophet ﷺ, was tending to the camels. So that was his job on this caravan. He was taking care of the camels. And we have a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, مَا بَعَثَ اللَّهُ نَبِيًّا إِلَّا رَعَى الْغَنَمِ. Every prophet has tended to sheep. No prophet was sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except he tended to sheep. فَقَالَ أَصْحَابُهُ وَأَنْتَ. So some of the companions said to the Prophet, even you, Ya Rasulullah? فَقَالَ نَعَمْ. Yes, كُنْتُ أَرْعَاهَا عَلَى قَرَارِيطَ لِأَهْلِ مَكَّةِ. I used to tend to the sheep for a few carrots. Carrots, not carrots, okay? Which means a few, some money, right? Very little money, not too much. That was what he did, alayhi sallam. So he worked as a shepherd. And from his experience as a shepherd, by the way, we have numerous hadith that is related to being a shepherd. The most famous being, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. Each and every one of you is a shepherd, each and every one of you is in charge of their flock. Which also could be also translated as what? وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ, meaning each and every one of you will be held to account for their flock, right? And so we all have charges and responsibilities that we will be held to account for. You're not just in charge of yourself, you're also in charge of a sphere of influence that is around you, that grows and changes with time, right? Maybe at one point in time it is very small, nobody else except you in that sphere of influence, but then it could be your friends, it could be colleagues, it could be siblings, it could be nephews, nieces, right? It could be other relatives. It could grow and have a larger influence. You never know, right? And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses you with marriage, it could be a spouse, could be own children, right? So point is, that sphere of influence changes with time. It's not always fixed, but we're going to be held to account for a sphere of influence. And the Prophet says, كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ إِثْمًا أَنْ يُضَيِّعَ مَنْ يَعُولُ. It is sufficient for a person to sin that they neglect the ones they're in charge of. Also, from the time of his work as a shepherd, there's a hadith, a very famous one, where he says, إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُ الذِّئْبُ مِنَ الْغَنَمِ الْقَاسِيَةِ, which means that the wolf will eat from the stray sheep. So alone we are prone to being attacked by the shaitan. But together, collectively, right, we are like a building that strengthens each other and gives support to one another. And so alone we're prone to being attacked, subhanAllah, and often, we have this comment or kind of a rule of law, a rule of thumb, as they say, that if you stop attending Jum'ah once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and you start disconnecting yourself from the Muslim community, right, that's the first step for a downhill spiral, walayathu billah, to falling away from connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why Jum'ah is actually an obligation upon men and very much recommended for sisters. So these are just some comments on this hadith and on this experience that the Prophet had, so we learn something from this as well, that your experiences as a young man, right, he was in his very early teens, really shapes who you are. So he learned very young to be in charge of something, to have a responsibility, to take care of things, right? So some of you may remember when you were forced to do chores at home and you may have been disgruntled about it and be upset about it, and why do you have to do these chores, and why can't somebody else do it, and why don't we have a servant, what am I, a slave, that kind of attitude, right? You can tell I'm suffering a lot for my children, they say this to me. So these things, they actually teach us something, alhamdulillah. All right, here is a very long hadith that is a very interesting one nonetheless, and it's in Sirat ibn Ishaq, also broken, there's no connection for the chain, so take it again with a grain of salt, but it does teach us something about the youth of the prophethood, the teenagehood of the Prophet ﷺ. And this was also when he was a shepherd ﷺ. So let's look at the translation. He says ﷺ, that I did not think of doing anything like the people of the Jahiliyyah, what they used to do, of attending concerts. So there was a certain concert or certain kind of related to music and whatnot, except for 2 nights, both of which Allah protected me from. One night I said to some young men of Mecca while we were tending to the sheep of our family, I said to my companion, look over my sheep so that I can enter Mecca and spend the evening there as a young man spends the evening. And he said, yes. So I entered Mecca, that is, meaning they were tending to sheep outside of Mecca. So he went to Mecca, and he says, when I reached the first house of Mecca, I heard music, trumpets and flutes. I said, what is this? It was said, so-and-so married so-and-so. So some kind of wedding was going on, and we all know what happens in weddings, sometimes even Muslim weddings, right? So I sat and watched. And then he says, Allah struck my ears, and by Allah, nothing woke me up except the touch of the sun. So I went back to my companion, and he said, what did you do? I said, I did nothing. And I told him what I had seen, what happened. Then I said to him another night, look over my sheep so that I can spend the evening in Mecca. So he did. And so I went in. And when I came to Mecca, I heard the same thing I heard that night. So I sat and watched. Allah struck my ears. And by Allah, nothing woke me up except the touch of the sun. So I went back to my companion, and he said, what did you do? I said, nothing. And I told him what happened. And then he says, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, by Allah, I did not think of anything like that, nor did I return to it after that, until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored me with His prophethood. To quote, he says, ما هممت ولا عدت بعدهما لشيء من ذلك حتى أكرمني الله بنبوته. And so we see here the tendency of young people to do certain things and to chill and to enjoy certain things. It is there in young people, and they just need guidance. In this case, in the case of the Prophet as he's reported to have said, أَدَّبَنِي رَبِّي فَأَحْسَنَ تَأْدِيبِي, my Lord raised me and perfected my raising. And so we need to recognize that as well. Our role, perhaps as younger siblings, older siblings, two younger ones, that perhaps you need to guard them, protect them from such influences. What about the political experience of the Prophet ﷺ? Well, there are two of them that we'll cover today, inshallah. One is what is known as Harbu Fijar, the War of Fijar. It so happens that Quraysh was in battle actually with a group. Quraysh is the people of Mecca, the tribe of the Prophet ﷺ. They were in battle or in war with another people. I think Qais Ailan. So Qais Ailan and Quraysh were at war with each other. And here in Ibn Hisham, the author says, وَشَهِدَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم بَعْضَ أَيَّامِهِم. He witnessed some of the days of that war. أَخْرَجَهُ أَعْمَامَهُ مَعَهُم. His uncles took him with them. How old was he? Narrations differ. Some say 16, some say 20. Right? But he was a young man when he went out in this battle. And the Messenger of Allah, the Prophet ﷺ, is reported to have said, I used to collect arrows for my uncles. Right? I used to collect arrows for my uncles. Kuntu ambulu ala a'mami. Meaning I would return the arrows of their enemy to them when they shot them. Right? You know, oftentimes when we see, Ortogl, for example, or any kind of heroes, we see them shooting arrows, right? We don't see them collecting those arrows. Actually, arrows takes a lot of time to make. So they don't just shoot them and then forget about them. Actually go and gather them. And so that was the case then as well. And so this was the role of the Prophet. He witnessed the battle, but he did not participate in the battle. And so there is a very weak interpretation that says, Kuntu ambulu instead of ala a'mami, ma'a a'mami. I used to shoot arrows with my uncles. So was that experience as an archer? We don't know, but like I said, weaker narration. This is the stronger one, but they're all weak, right? That basically it says what? That he used to collect the arrows for his uncles, and which gives more credence to the opinion that he was younger, right? He was not 20, he was much younger than that. Perhaps if he was older, he would have participated a little bit more in that war. So he witnessed war. He witnessed battle. And you can imagine, like as a young person witnessing war and witnessing battle, to kind of get an impression and a recognition that war is a necessary evil, but it's evil. And it's something that should be avoided. And so throughout the seerah of the Prophet, throughout the life of the Prophet, we will see examples of how the Prophet avoided war and avoided bloodshed and worked hard to avoid, battle and war, even sometimes at his own expense, right? Sulh al-Hudaybiyah is one example. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah that he did with the disbelievers of Mecca was actually viewed by all of the Sahaba to be an unfair treaty, right? It was viewed to be unfair, but he did it, alayhi salam. Why? Because the outcome was peace, and of course the Prophet is supported with revelation, and that is, it would end the war and it would allow people to hear the message of truth and come to Islam. By the way, another tangent, Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, we'll come to it in more detail, is not like normalizing with the occupier, just to be clear. Because normalizing with the occupier is actually treachery against your fellow believers that are actually still being killed, right, by the occupier. That's not what the Prophet did, alayhi salam. He had a peace agreement with the disbelievers, and in it is that every believer is to be respected, and even if he or she is to be retained in Mecca, because that was the case, like everyone, if any, somebody from Mecca, for example, believes, he cannot, kind of seek refuge in Medina. He has to be returned to Mecca. But the conditions were, he would be returned to Mecca, but not face torture, not face persecution, right? And so it's very important to recognize that the Prophet did not normalize relationships with enemy that is actually killing your brethren. Very big difference. All right, we are now touching on perhaps the last experience for today, and that is Hilf al-Fudul, the Treaty of Fudul. Here the Prophet is reported to have said, Shahidtu Hilfan fi dari ibn Jud'an. A man named Ibn Jud'an, in his house there was a coalition that happened, an agreement between Banu Hashim, Zuhra and Taym, and he was among them, alayhi salatu wasalam. And he says, وَلَوْ دُعِيتُ بِهِ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ لَأَجَبْتُ. If such a coalition I were to be invited to in Islam, during Islam, I would have responded. And he praises it even further. He says, وَمَا أُحِبُّ أَنْ أَخِيسَ بِهِ, meaning I would not have wanted to disappoint it. If I had been invited to it, I would have responded, and I do not like to disappoint it, even though if I had or have red camels. وَإِنَّ لِي حُمُرَ النِّعَمِ. So if he was offered red camels, very expensive merchandise, in exchange of violating that treaty or disappointing that treaty, he would not have done it. That's how he's praising the treaty, saying it's very important and it was a good treaty. What was this treaty? So here's a description of it. It was a treaty or a coalition that enjoined what is right and forbade what is wrong, and did not leave anyone with anything that was better than anyone else without taking it. And that is why it was called the coalition of virtues. Right? So the story goes is that a man named Al-As ibn Wa'il, who was the father of Amr ibn Al-As, Al-As ibn Wa'il refused to pay for merchandise that he took from someone. There was a merchant that gave merchandise to Al-As ibn Wa'il. Al-As ibn Wa'il refused to pay. And this person had nobody to go to. Al-As ibn Wa'il was a very powerful man with a very powerful tribe, and this was a stranger to Mecca, had nobody to support him. So he kept on going to people asking for their support, but nobody wanted to stand up to Al-As ibn Wa'il, right? Until eventually a coalition was formed to uphold what is right and to ensure that nobody is a victim of injustice. Eventually, of course, unfortunately, the disbelievers of Mecca violated the treaty, but the Prophet praised it nonetheless, which shows something important. The Prophet praises something that happened before Islam. So before Islam is, yes, the days of ignorance, the days of Jahiliyyah, yes, but there are still good things there. And we reflected on the hadith where he says, خِيَارُكُمْ فِي الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ خِيَارُكُمْ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ إِذَا فَقِهُوا. The best amongst you during the days of ignorance will be the best amongst you in the days of Islam if they comprehend and understand. Praising good characteristics. And the Prophet says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was sent to perfect the best of ethics and character. In conclusion, these are some questions that I hope that you try to answer, inshallah. How would you raise a young Muslim, should have put an A there. What negative influences of today would you protect them from? How is this relevant to us? These are questions that I hope that you can answer, inshallah, the next 10 minutes or so. So we'll break into groups and have you try to answer these questions and share with a larger audience, inshallah. Anything good I said is from Allah alone. Any mistakes are my own. I ask you to forgive me for it. Barakallahu feekum. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.